Hello and welcome to the ninth in the series of our DDES Miami Urban Studies Miami Do You Love Me series. Miami Do You Love Me, the theme is based on the fact that Miami is Italian for You Love Me. Before we start today, I just want to mention briefly that this weekend the clocks will change, and that will mean a disruption to the starting time, but we will keep to the original starting time for all our DDES sessions. That'll be 9 o'clock in the morning EST on Fridays and Sundays and Mondays. So today we're going to be following on from last week. Last week we had a session, a very beautiful session actually on Cuban Miami. There are of course a lot of Cuban emigres in Miami, but so too there are a lot of South American, Latin American emigres who really have a huge impact on the culture of Miami. So the question we'll be addressing today is what is the attraction about Miami for the Latin American community, and what indeed do they add to Miami itself? And what we'll be dealing with, we have a number of my colleagues here. Elisa Silva, who is from Venezuela and the States, Henry Rueda from Venezuela, Alfredo Andia, who is from Chile, Camilo Rosales, who's from Nicaragua, Glenda Puente, who is from Ecuador. We have an astonishing number of colleagues from all over Latin America, which is precisely what makes Miami so rich as a city, and precisely what makes FIU so rich as a community. I'm not going to say anything about the biographies today, because actually what we're dealing with is biographies. The theme here is the idea that a city is nothing without its inhabitants, and the inhabitants are really have their own stories. Every individual has his or her own story about their background. So we'll be hearing that. So I won't give any background as such, except to say these are all distinguished colleagues of mine at FIU School of Architecture. But what I will say is that this is a theme, identity and belonging, that is something that is, I think, in many ways very dear to me. We had a discussion about this with Elisa, who wasn't sure whether she belonged anywhere, and certainly maybe not to Miami, a place that she hasn't lived as yet because of COVID. She's a very newly appointed colleague. But it was a theme in my book, Camouflage, and I'm somebody who, like most of us here, in fact, everyone here, is somehow has had a nomadic existence. I was brought up in a military family, born in the UK, but then we moved to Hong Kong, then back to the UK, then to Germany, and then back to the UK. And meanwhile, I've taught as a visiting professor in many of the countries around the world, in the States, in China, in Australia, in Europe, and the UK. So the theme about kind of adaptation, about identity and belonging, is a central one to Camouflage. An identity in some ways that is a non-identity, a sense of belonging in the sense of a sense of not belonging, and a sense of belonging that actually brings with it a lack of belongings as such. When you travel around the world, you don't have many belongings to take with you. You have memories, perhaps. And so equally, as a nomad, it also makes you aware of the point from which you are a nomad, your point of origin. Anyway, I don't want to say too much. This is not a theory lecture. This is really about the stories of my colleagues. But I just want to offer some really kind of beautiful comments that came. I found now the writings of others that I included in Camouflage. Walter Benjamin, especially, was someone who had I've always found a very rich and evocative thinker, and he speaks about how architecture, especially the architecture and the life of being brought up in Berlin, had a huge impact on molding him, on forging his identity. He describes how, as a child, as a toddler, in a cot, he would hear the screeching of the trams and other noises, these impulses that register themselves on his own identity. The rhythm of streetcars and carpet beating rocked me in my sleep. It was the mold in which my dreams took place. And I began to sort of see this as kind of like a dynamic that was going on in all forms of identity. How you were kind of it was born of these kind of impacts, these impulses that you registered, and also in terms of those that you've left behind. There is a very beautiful comment from Sigmund Freud. Identity is a graveyard of lost loves and former identifications. And that really points towards the possibility that to the fact that identity is a kind of also a sense of non-identity, of non-identification at the same time as identification itself. And of course, we find in the work of Lacan, who describes that moment when we discover really who we are in the mirror stage essay, he talks about how we recognize ourselves as an object in a world of objects separated from our mother. And that's that point of being separate that allows us to identify with other individuals, to start forging our own sense of identity. And the book itself, when Peter Eisenman read it, he said, "Well, I think it's a book that in need of a of a subtitle." And I thought about it for some time, and I thought maybe it should have been belonging, camouflage towards a theory of belonging. But when I checked yesterday, looking through the doing a search, I found that actually there were 57 references to belonging, but 147 references to identity. So maybe it's a book about identity, which is a very mercurial, difficult thing to describe. And Lacan goes on from Freud to talk about this idea about identity as being constituted as much through distinction as through connection. Identity is born from interaction between the self and other as a continual process of attraction, of repulsion, of belonging in some sense and not belonging. But importantly, he introduces the sense of the city, of your environment, as an important factor in the formation of your identity. Your identity is forged, as it were, or molded against that background. It involves connecting with a given environment, but importantly also distinguishing oneself from that environment. These processes, moreover, appear to be related. One can only connect what is separated and separate what is connected. That's the kind of thought that comes from Georg Simmel. And so I also commented on the question about belonging. I mean, identity is a very kind of rich and elusive subject. But I also introduced the concept of belonging. I was interested in the work of Judith Butler, who sees identity as a kind of form of performativity, which is to say an iteration of successive performances. You are how you behave, as it were, rather than how you are assigned biologically. So belonging has been associated with Judith Butler's work, the idea that as you're performing certain rituals and certain performances in your life, you begin to achieve an attachment to place. So belonging was a concept that I brought in, a provisional rhizomatic model of attachment to place. And I'm trying to suggest that maybe dwelling, which is a more static notion, is something we need to sort of abandon in favor of something that allows for this nomadic existence that is so characteristic of how we live. For just as identity itself is no longer a fixed condition, but an ever renegotiable site of individual expression, so belonging offers us an equally flexible concept that can accommodate the transitory nature of contemporary existence. In a realm whose paradigmatic figures include the wanderer, the migrant, the refugee, the exile, the notion of belonging offers a more sympathetic framework for understanding contemporary modes of identification with place. In addition, maybe to the wanderer, the migrant, the refugee, and the exile, we could perhaps add the visiting professor, and so on and so on. So I don't want I will stop sharing my screen and invite Henry Rueda to offer some reflections of his own. Henry, welcome.
Thank you, Neil. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. It's great to be with my colleagues, Alfredo, Camilo, Glenda, Elisa, and you, Neil, and the students. And I think I saw Great Reed and Jason Chandler also here. So thanks for the invitation to kind of talk a little bit about what the city of Caracas and the sort of this idea of Venezuela, Miami, Caracas, Miami, Venezuela, the US, had been kind of forming for myself, and some of the let's say the background that I have, right, that I somehow brought to FIU, and that I carry with me here in Miami. So I'm just gonna sort of describe a little bit where our city is, where the city of Caracas is, and use some kind of geographical quotes and images. But one thing that I guess is completely inherent to the American continent, the continent of America, is this place of exiles, right? Where sort of after the Spanish sort of conquerors, the establishment in our countries was basically a Spanish, the natives and the slaves, right? That created the mix that in Venezuela basically formed the society. And this quote by Jose Ignacio Cabrujas, who was a playwright in Venezuela, that he wrote in 1988, he describes the city as a kind of mix of three different exiles. The conquerors who went to Venezuela, not because they wanted to, because they found it, or to the Americas, but it was an accidental sort of finding. And they were not the most surprised citizens. They were basically outlaws and people who were kind of thrown into those ships to see, if they could find something or bring something back. The second exile were the natives, or the sort of the indigenous people that lived in the region, that were somehow displaced of their language, of their cultures, of everything that they knew and lived by. And the third were the slaves that came from Africa, with no sort of no clear intention, like or knowledge of where they were going to. Right? So, and that created this kind of melting pot of cultures. Venezuela, on the other hand, had been it's a very small country in terms of the population, and had been for years receptive of many sort of migration waves, kind of similar to Miami in that sense. And the cities, like I'm not originally from Caracas, I'm from a smaller city, but let's say my classroom from like my early years was always a mix of kids from Italian parents, Spanish parents, Portuguese, I mean, local, like myself, 100% Venezuelan. And it was always, this kind of weird, or not weird, but complex mix of children that were together in a classroom, right? Very similar to what we see here in Miami. And they all came in different sort of times. Like after the war, Venezuela received, I think it was like 1 million immigrants from Europe, basically Italy, Spain, and Portugal. But during the sort of the Nazi sort of occupation of cities, a lot of the Jewish families that were sort of sent to America in these ships, at some point they started closing the borders because they didn't want to allow more immigrants. Venezuela was one of the only countries that kept sort of the borders open and received, also hundreds of Jews. And then in the 70s, with the dictatorships in South America, a lot of like people from Chile and Argentina and Uruguay went to Venezuela. And then in the 80s, with the violence in Colombia, it was like an immense group of immigrants from Colombia. And it's been always kind of like that until recent years, when the political situation in Venezuela started to change, and this sort of panorama kind of shifted. And as speaking for myself, for the first time we thought of like migrating or going somewhere else as a family. So I just want to read this quote. Now then, how can a city of exiles be definite? Therefore, the city we have built is an eternal return to the future. Something awaits us, something we sense as an achievement, as a certainty, as the place where we will be able to recognize ourselves in the Platonic way of the cave, right? So this sort of transitory condition of cities, I think it's always with us. in our continent. So I like this photo, this sort of aerial view of Caracas, and it has a lot of meaning for this conversation, because Venezuela as a country has a condition that I guess we share with Colombia and other countries, but mainly with Colombia, that we are at the top of the South American continent. So we face the Caribbean. We are a Caribbean country, but at the same time, we're a South American country. And what we see here is the valley of Caracas with the mountain that separates the city from the Caribbean Sea. So on the other side of the mountain, like right here, if you see my cursor, is the ocean. And if you swim, straight, you get to Miami, let's say, right, or to the US. So that's how close we are. And I will show a couple of maps. But one thing that is very relevant with this photograph is that mountain, that system of mountains, is what makes the city of Caracas a South American city, in the sense that we don't have any of the challenges that Caribbean coastal cities have. Like, we do not receive any impact from hurricanes or any of the natural, let's say, disasters that will happen in the region, because we're pretty high. It's 1,000 meters above sea level, and we are protected by that wall, right? And it, it's a tropical city, but it has different sort of environmental conditions, right? And at the same time, it's 25 minutes drive to the ocean, right? Like, you just drive through these sort of winding road that take you to the coast, and you are in front of all the Caribbean islands and everything you see. Caracas is the biggest city in Venezuela, and it's at the sort of the moment of maximum sort of density is 4 million people. And so and Venezuela as a country is like 25, 30 million people. I mean, it fluctuates. And right now, with the, let's say, the displacement and the crisis, it's very difficult to know the numbers, I would say, but we'll talk a little bit about that later. So this condition, right, and I just brought these maps of sort of the maritime maps of the sort of made in Spain to basically describe sort of the region of the Caribbean, right? So if we see here, this is all very connected in terms of Española Island, which is Dominican Republic and Haiti, Cuba, all the smaller islands that are, some are French, some are British, some are Dutch. That reflects all the wars and the conflicts in the Caribbean, of course, but then Central America with Colombia, Panama, and all the countries up to Mexico and the US, right? So many depictions of what Venezuela is, you will find like exactly like this map, where you only see the top, sort of the northern region of the country, and you don't see the southern sort of region where the Venezuela meets the equator, or it doesn't touch the equator, but it's very close. And this is, one of our familiar maps, right? Together with the South American map, and just to locate everybody in this conversation. So this is Caracas, right? And this is Miami right here. So this is let's say, to put it in sort of measurable numbers, this is a 3 hours flight, right? So it's incredibly close. And the relationship with the US is been traditionally very intense in terms of the economy of the country, because Venezuela is an oil-based economy, and all the oil exploitation started with American companies and European companies, but it was mainly sort of a trade with the US, with US companies and US capital. So that brought to Venezuela multiple elements that you find in the islands of the Caribbean that you don't find in other countries south of the equator, right? Like, just an anecdotal simple comment: Venezuela's sport is baseball, is not football or soccer like in the other countries in South America. We're the worst team in South America, and we're next to Brazil, and we play with like Argentina and Peru and Colombia and all those countries that produce incredible players. But we do have a huge batch of baseball players playing in the big leagues here in the U.S., which I guess Glenda would probably say it, or Camilo or Alfredo. They don't do baseball in other countries in South America. So that's part of the let's say the richness and the close relationship with the United States. It's been like that since ever, right? So trying to also look at myself and look at ourselves in sort of retrospect and understanding where we're going, like what's happening with our country and how has history sort of depicted Venezuela. I'm very interested in Alexander von Humboldt, who traveled to the Americas and extensively mapped what he saw, right? He was a German cartographer, botanist, scientist, basically sponsored by the Kingdom of Spain to travel to the Americas and basically discover sort of natural richness and map everything he saw. And his trips were challenges because of the sort of the overwhelming presence of nature, right? So these are like part of his archives and how he depicted, or the elements that they built to basically go across rivers like the Amazons or the Orinoco, or like all these rivers, but at the same time the mountains like El Chimborazo or many places that they travel, and he was always amazed of nature, right? This is something that South America and all Latin American countries share, like from the whole American continent, right? But one thing that is sort of overwhelming is this condition of the natural elements, and if we say against the man-made constructions that are so little compared to this, right? So Humboldt traveled to the Americas with his friend Aimé Bonpland, and the first stop was Venezuela as a continent because it's on that border, if you remember the map. And in one of his letters, he described to his brother something that I just want to read, because this is something that if you go to Caracas today, you could probably write the same letter. So, what color of birds, fish, even crabs, sky blue and yellow. So far, we have wandered like fools. In the first 3 days, we couldn't identify anything because one object is tossed aside to pursue another. Bonpland assures me he will go mad if the marvels do not stop. Still more beautiful even than these individual miracles is the overall impression made by this powerful, lush, and yet so gentle, exhilarating, mild vegetation. The travels of Humboldt are also incredible because they brought all these amazing artifacts. One of them, which was kind of like a crazy idea, was that what they called the cyanometer, which was an instrument to measure the blueness of the sky, right? And one thing that I guess Elisa probably back me up with that, and Camilo, who had been to Venezuela, and maybe Alfredo and Glenda, is the light, right? Like, is that light that in our country is so gentle, let's put it that way. But also, and this is 1799, right? And there is also a comment by Humboldt, and he saw slavery in Venezuela, and he found it disturbing, and he basically said, it's the greatest of all evils which have afflicted mankind. And I could also argue that still happens with different names. So part of the travels of Humboldt in these sort of diagrammatic maps, which are pretty beautiful because of what he visited and what he skipped, right? So the region, which is number 2, is what used to be, or today is Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador, right? And this is the first trip. That's how he landed, and then all the other countries that he visited, which were part of Spain. And he only stopped in the US on his way back. And he didn't want to go back because Europe was not a safe place and he wanted to stay in the US. So there is a kind of history because he felt safe in the US and he didn't want to go back to conflicting countries and wars and things like that. And he described himself as half American, like he was in love with the US and sort of the idea of America, right? So all these trips, I mean, this, if you imagine like that sort of beautiful drawing of that bridge, he will go across all of these, right? And the reason why this was, he was taking these routes to like Peru and back to Central America, was basically because Brazil, which is a gigantic country, was part of Portugal. So it didn't belong to Spain. And I could probably say that they would have not survived going across the Amazon those days. In his descriptions, he talks about mosquitoes all the time. Like he talks how like they couldn't draw, they couldn't write the letters because they were being attacked by nasty mosquitoes all the time. And then at night, the native they put them to sleep in these constructions with like fire inside. So they were suffocating from the fire, but they were free of mosquitoes. So it was all these, imagine all these sort of traveling conditions those days. Yet they found it, they found they marveled with all the beauty that they discovered. So that brings me to kind of today's reality, right? Sort of the migration routes of Venezuelans going to South America and to the world. But one of the elements that is surprising, for me at least, that I spent, born in Venezuela and spent my whole life in Venezuela, is seeing people traveling, walking out of the country, right? And these red routes that we see here is how people manage to leave the country, basically crossing the border to Colombia. And from there, they take buses or they find a way to go all the way south. And this is perhaps not complete because there are Venezuelans, I guess, all the way to Patagonia today, right? And it's less sort of travel across Brazil because of many reasons. One, the Amazons, and the second, the language, right? So a lot of the migration goes to where people feel safer, have relative, of course, but also the language and the culture is somehow similar. So if we see here, this is from 2019, and this is 1.4 million people living in Colombia, Venezuelans living in Colombia. And in the US is 300 and something, which is a number that had basically stayed kind of constant like that. There is another map. Okay, so what the sort of the situation and is happening today, right? Like this is the Simón Bolívar bridge that basically goes from Venezuela to Colombia, which is the image on the left, right? And how people basically with very little means of surviving, they just go across. Of course, this is a crisis. Of course, there is everything could happen on these sort of trips, if we call. One thing that the migration somehow brings with the sort of part of the package is the question of returning. Like people go across that bridge, and are they going back? Is there any way they're going to come back? Maybe not, right? And this is a recent image of people that are crossing the border during the pandemic, right? Which had brought a complete different situation that is still more dramatic, because the displacement to, like in many cases, to Colombia or to Brazil, a lot of people were like forced to return because of the conditions where they were living. So they had to like walk back to the country where they were like received and put in these camps to quarantine. So it's a pretty complicated sort of panorama of a social crisis that is happening. So once the migrants are on the side of Colombia, they take buses or they just hitchhike to the place where they know someone. And what is the cause of this? Yes, there is the political instability or political system that people disagree with. There is also the shortage of resources like electricity, water, gasoline. With that comes many other elements, like if there is not sort of stable electricity, imagine sort of computer systems, Wi-Fi, internet, things like that. Not running water, health, it's complicated. And that had brought people, out of the country, together with violence, crime, and other elements that we can name, right? So this is the most recent sort of map, and sort of as of February 2021, 5.5 million Venezuelans had left the country and are distributed in everywhere around the world. And in the US, I was trying to find more updated data, but I couldn't find. The population is kind of like this, right? The distribution, the sort of the biggest population is here in South Florida. And this is basically people that are here in completely different status, like legal, illegal, working, not working, you name it, right? And then the second state would be Texas and things like that, right? So this is more or less the panorama of what is sort of the situation with Venezuelans. But I want to talk about the city. I want to talk about Caracas and this sort of phenomenal place where I basically found myself as an architect, because this is where I went to college. This is where I studied. This is where I did sort of my growth in this field. And I moved to Caracas in 1983. And this was sort of years of prosperous sort of not only economical, but also cultural richness. And when I started architecture school, I moved from a smaller city. I lived in two cities before when I was growing in the provinces, and then I went to college and I moved to Caracas because where I was coming from, there was no architecture schools, and those were the years where like the music, the culture, the museums, the galleries, the theater, the everything was happening, and it was like this sort of incredible place where you could go to a Henry Moore exhibition in the museum, and then at night you would go see Lindsay Kemp, Shakespeare, and the architecture school was packed with people doing stuff, and it was a pretty optimistic time, right? And that's how I see that was like my encounter with the city, and I went to the Universidad Central, which is the public university, sort of the most important public university in the country, which when we say public university in Latin America is completely free. We pay $0 or bolivares. And I went to this amazing campus that without knowing much about it, because I was 17 years old, right? And I was amazed of discovering all these buildings, but I was coming from also a pretty amazing high school that was designed and built by these Spanish Basque architects. because I went to La Salle, which is a Spanish priest, and I was not unfamiliar with exposed concrete. Let's put it that way. Right? So I found myself in this amazing place where like the Carlos Raúl Villanueva design campus and the sort of the integration of the arts in every building was a kind of open air museum. And that's where, you know, Alexander Calder and Villanueva collaborated in designing the sort of the main auditorium of the school. So this is where I got my degree of architecture, right? And this, you take this for granted. Now when I look back, it's like I have like chills right now looking at this and thinking that every Saturday I will go to a concert in this place, right, with this amazing Alexander Calder clouds. And this is the quality of those spaces, right? Because Villanueva, who was Venezuelan, 100% Venezuelan, but he was born in London and he was raised in France, in Paris. He went to Venezuela for the first time when he was 28 years old, but he was the son of diplomatic family, and when he was born, when you were born outside your country, as a diplomat, you were born and registered at the embassy. So he was born in London, but he was never British because he was Venezuelan, and he always spoke with an accent, a French accent, because he was raised and educated in Paris. Right? So he was a strange sort of person, but he was the one who understood the climate and the sort of the potential and the possibilities of that culture to create something as amazing as the university, and all his works, which were master classes on tropical architecture, right? I'm going to talk a little bit about that later, because that's one, let's say, one conflict with tropical architecture in Venezuela and tropical architecture in Miami, but we'll talk a little bit about that later. So these are the sort of the open air spaces around the main auditorium, the library, and all sort of the cultural section of the university campus. Then I went to Columbia University. So I moved to New York to get a master's degree, and I went to this cold place. Kind of travel back in time to these historical monumental buildings and the sort of the load of the American institutions. That was fantastic, and it was incredible. And from that experience, and this was during the Bernard Schumi years at Columbia University, and sort of meeting with all the faculty, all the classmates, and everything that was happening in New York was kind of a growing experience that, when I look back, I don't remember one single day that I was not like super excited about anything, about something, because it was so overwhelming, the activity of the city, and everything that I was discovering, right? So it was another kind of milestone that from there took me to Maastricht in the Netherlands, where one of my professors, Will Arets, that I did my final studio with, invited me and another classmate to go work for him. So 2 days after graduation, I took a flight from New York to Manchester, Amsterdam, and then a train to Maastricht. And then I stayed working with him for a year in this very exotic place for me in the Netherlands. And I have to say, as much as I loved working for him and the architecture that he does and everything, and the office was great, there was a moment where I felt like asking myself every day, like, what am I doing here? Who are these people? Like, I couldn't recognize myself in anyone that I was seeing, in the trains, in the buses, like at the bar, and I for the first time, I felt like a complete stranger, but happy. And then After that, I went back to New York briefly, and then I returned to Caracas to start my own practice and my teaching, which I did for many, many years before moving to Miami. So back in Caracas, my practice modeled after a sequence of events that are completely accidental, nothing planned, that took me to the design of single family homes more than anything. And I was looking at these kind of masters and my heroes at that time and still today, like Gio Ponti, who designed 5 houses in Caracas, and this one, the Villa Planchard, that is up and perfectly kept by the family. It was one of the masterpieces that he designed and built and supervised up to the minimum sort of detail. And these are the plans of that building that some of you might be familiar with his layouts and his designs. And this is an Italian from Milan, sort of designing a building in the tropics and creating a tropical house, right? And I'm sorry, there's a shift in the slides. And this moment in the house, this photo is like where the tropical garden meets what they call the tropical dining room, which is a completely open space with all these kind of art integrated on the walls. This is the I don't know how to say it without sounding strange, but this is the peak of the sort of the Venezuelan wealth in terms of everything was imported, even the marble for the floors, the mural, like the art in the house, the china. He designed the silverware, the everything, and everything was designed by him in Milan and produced in Italy. And it's this kind of museum house that could only happen in a place like this, right? And then some of my local heroes, like Fruto Vivas, who designed this vernacular modern architecture that is absolutely adjusted to the local environment and the climate. As you see in both photos, and I will show another one, everything is open and everything sort of relies on cross ventilation and daylight. So this idea of the tropical, where you create shade and you define spaces where people can stay, right? Or Richard Neutra, who the American architect who designed this kind of incredible house up in one of the mountains overlooking the city, and how sort of the approach of his design that is very similar to what he was doing in California. This is perhaps more sort of attached or adapted to the topography in the sense of it's in one of the very steep hill overlooking the city and open to these amazing views with this sort of panoramic glass, right? So from there, I mean, from looking at these masters, who like I still kind of work around this idea of the private homes, and understanding what is you know, the sort of the tropical architecture language. I work around sort of ideas by Paulo Mendes Arrocha, the Brazilian architect, and his take on private versus public space. And I designed and built these homes. I'm just going to go kind of quick about these buildings where we sort of aim to integrate nature in the spaces, sort of the tropical condition of our buildings, also the elements that we care for, like light and cross ventilation, but also courtyards, and, you know, kind of placing the domestic, the concept of domesticity in cities that are like very unsafe, because there are a lot of our designs are sort of meet the challenges of security devices and elements, and at the same time, and this is kind of like closer to when I was relocated to Miami, I started working with artists, and I opened a gallery also in Venezuela. And I started working with young artists that were kind of working and representing their time in the city. And I always sort of value the sort of the look of an artist that could see opportunities where sometimes we see challenges and problems. And this is one of my, so today is one of my best friends. He was a local artist that was collecting bags from one of the social sort of crises of people selling stuff with these bags. That's a long story. So he will trade these plastic bags, and then he will iron these bags and glue all of these and create these, what he called paintings. And his house, which is on the left, like he did this piece and he sent me a photo, like, I just finished it, but I have no place to put it. And so he climbed to the top of the roof and he put it there, and which I love because there is like a neo-Gothic church in the background, and all this mess, right? All this trash, and then his work. And it's sort of that kind of opened my eyes to a completely different landscape and a completely different way of understanding our cities, right? Which was not as polished as before, and it was not as pristine, right? Let's say. And with him, we worked and we had a pretty intense sort of collaboration. And this is one of those pieces that we sent to one of the museums, one of the art institutions where he won like one of the top prizes, and with the same sort of structural elements that are like pretty basic and rustic. The same piece was, or a similar piece was in the museum, and that's like one of my prides, right? So this relationship with the local sort of art community and private clients somehow was at the end of my days in Caracas, or not the end, because I can always go back. I was, you know, I think I was talking to Neil at some point, like the sort of this concept of refugee, exile, diaspora somehow feels strange to me. I mean, I took an airplane, I came here, you know, I paid for my ticket, I landed here. I mean, I'm not. I'm part of that population of exiles, but I can always go back. And the situation in Venezuela is, the borders are not closed. I mean, part of my family is still there. I mean, because of other sort of migration issues, I'm not able to go at this time because of other paperwork. But I can always go back. And in sort of my timeline of growing as an architect, or forming myself as an architect, there was a moment in 2007 when a group of friends that some of you know, we decided to create an organization, a nonprofit organization, basically to help in the construction of sort of critical discourse and promoting, we can use that word, the sort of local architecture that was happening in Caracas, right? This was also because of the lack of resources and the lack of activities from the sort of the local universities, or the lack of publications. So there was a void, and this is very Venezuelan. There was a void, and we met at a coffee shop, and we decided, let's try and do something. And then we created this fantastic Fundación Espacio that is still running with Franco Micucci, one of my friends and colleagues who's still in Caracas. And we did almost like a little school of architecture in the city. We did exhibitions, we did books, we brought international architects to talk in incredible big auditoriums that we found sponsorships to do that. We did movies, lectures. We brought we actually focused on Latin American architects, and through these we met people from Colombia, like Giancarlo Massanti and other friends, people from Brazil, like Angelo Bucci, people from Peru, like Alexia Leon. We invited Nader Terani, who is from Iran. He's Iranian US, but he had a close relationship, past close relationship with Caracas. With Sebastián Adamu from Argentina, Martín Golano from Uruguay, Mauricio Rocha from Mexico, and other people. And to me, the Fundación Espacio was more than anything a kind of point of departure without knowing. But this sort of helped me I saw myself in context with all these Latin American architects and friends, and doing something that created a network that made me realize, and then after a couple of years traveling to countries and visiting everybody, that there is a friendship, that there is a kind of relationship that we could establish with all these people in different countries, that it's pretty valuable. And it didn't happen before. Like, I was completely focused on my practice and my teaching in Caracas. And this, the sort of the Fundación kind of made me realize sort of the potential of being in a place like Caracas, those years that were kind of heavy in terms of political unrest. And, but at the same time, very welcoming to sort of friends and inviting to other people. And I want to close with this image of Caracas in the 50s, with the background of that mountain that we started with, and sort of the open air, the people that kind of sitting outside with the elements, with the breeze, with the hot temperature, and the birds, and everything that Humboldt saw when he first went to the Americas. And thank you very much. And I just pass this to Elisa.
Thank you, Henry. Yes, fantastic segue. Yeah, my applauses as well. I will go ahead and share my screen. Thank you for the invitation to be here, and I'm very excited to meet this cohort. I too am Venezuelan and American. I'm going to talk about sort of my trajectory and where it overlaps with issues of identity, and try to sort of pick up in the time frame in those years that Henry was mentioning, where we worked together in Fundación Espacio in Caracas. But actually, I'm going to backtrack just a couple of years before that to maybe make some sense out of it. I was educated in the United States. I went even to high school in St. Louis, Missouri, and my architecture degree is from Harvard. I then worked for Rafael Meneo in Spain for a couple of years, which was a very important part of my kind of early professional life. And to fast forward, I wasn't too incredibly excited about practicing in offices in the United States, and was encouraged by an art history professor I had in undergraduate to apply to the Rome Prize, and lo and behold, won. What I want to rescue is the influence that these particular individuals had on me. They were all there at the same time, fantastic artists of the caliber of Carrie Mae Weems, Ward Shelley and Alexander Schrader, who do these incredible interventions of public space, where they stay overnight even and they inhabit them. Richard Barnes, he's a very well-known photographer. He did the Unabomber, photography of the Unabomber home. And Rabbi Johannesma, who is Dutch, but was there at the same time. And what I thought was just amazing about them is the dedication they gave to their work. I hadn't been that close to visual artists before. They get up early, have their coffee, but then go straight into studio and produce. And it is really about this kind of rigor and dedication to something that is very important to them, that fuels not just their work, their life, their outlook on life. It just really permeates every aspect of them. And I thought that to be extraordinary, beautiful, something that I wanted to somehow emulate, that degree of integration between all aspects of themselves and their identities. And I remembered that while I was still in Madrid, I participated in a competition called Elemental Chile, which was before the actual firm Elemental began, and a call for projects that would be ostensibly directed to low-income neighborhoods or barrios. And we received one of the mentions as an award, but the prizes were given to 7 projects that were very formal, very much about the structure of the home. And just the summer before I had visited Venezuela, I always visited every summer as much as I could, and got to be in the Barrio La Palomera with my uncle, and I'll show in a bit my uncle, my dear uncle, Tío Juan. It just didn't seem to jive at all with what was being awarded. It left me a very unsettling feeling of a topic that I actually grew interested in, even as a student. I had Aravena as a professor. It was his very, very first semester teaching in the US at Harvard. And I will always be grateful to him for introducing me to this issue of precariousness, of scarce resources, of emergencies, although I do not coincide at all with his approximation. And as I was sort of unsettling or digesting this unsettling feeling, and thinking about, in my time in Rome, what the next step would be, I was reminded of a conversation I had with Maneo while in the taxi cab with him going to the Prado. He was going to go for a site visit and asked me to come for, I don't remember what reason, but in the cab I asked him, if he had, I probably was very nervous, asked him if he had, what projects were on the horizon, if there were any international projects. And with his voice, it's so, I won't do it as if I was talking about, but I can imitate him very well. He said, no, Elisa, there's a lot to do in Madrid. And that really struck me, like this sense of an architect of the place. And I have 2 countries that I have been formed in and that I belong to by birth, by parents of different countries. It was not really a popular thing to imagine to go to Venezuela in 2007. Franco Micucci, who Henry just mentioned, when I talked to him about it, said, that's ridiculous, Elisa, disparate, as we say in Spanish, for you to come. But of course, once I did go, he completely embraced me. I went to teach that very next day that I arrived with Henry and Franco at the Universidad Simón Bolívar, practically just as I hit the tarmac. And in a few more days, I think, we decided to start this foundation, Fundación Espacio. So I've lifted, and the picture is from the presentation of one of our books in 2012. So for Henry, this was a moment of opening himself to a context of Latin America. For me, it was very much about arriving in Venezuela, in Caracas, a country where I had not lived for 20 years, and did not really know the architecture scene locally, nor did I particularly have connections, friends from nor high school, nor college, nor graduate school, nor professionally. So Fundación Espacio was this beautiful way for me to insert myself in Venezuela. And yes, it was fantastic to have access and get to know all these personalities. Alexia Leon, I remember I asked Jorge Silvetti to allow me to get in touch with her. We all just sort of branched out and met people. And my very first project, which was this competition that I won, the pavement for Sabana Grande, a huge, huge endeavor. It was a mile long, 1.6 kilometers. And I never in my wildest dreams imagined that this was going to come through. It's about 1 million square meters of pavement. So 100,000 square meters, 1 million square feet, sorry. And yes, I had, Rome in my memories, the San Pietrini, which are fantastic, and pavements from baths, and that I translated into this kind of obsessive research on patterns that built on even previous work that I had done, that I took advantage of Rome to put together these kind of sails that I called vela, which produced a pattern for that. And I'm not going to really explain this project, but it was also through Fundación Espacio that we met, and Franco and Henry met him in Chile, but and then invited him to come to Caracas, and he gave a seminar at the Universidad Central de Venezuela. It's Antonio Liptai, who's here on the right side of the photograph. He presented a project that he was working on in Valparaíso just then, of all the pavements for a particular barrio called Cerros El Toro and Cerro Santo Domingo. That was just incredible. I mean, they hadn't built any. These are photographs after the project was finished, and these are photographs that I took myself when I visited him in 2012 with the Wheelwright Fellowship. But a very extensive project. This is part of actually my book, but it shows really well where the project. And the drawings were so fantastic. He even really belabored over this detail to get the staircases to fit into one another without distortions on site. And it inspired me to work that much harder on preparing the plans for the Sabana Grande pavement project. Henry remembers me saying that, I was so impressed that I hadn't slept for 2 weeks meeting the deadline with all this kind of increased precision that I imposed on myself, thanks to Antonio's inspiration, for sure. That same very first year in Caracas, I began working on the Church of Media Legua, which is a rural setting. And here you can still see those influences from my curiosities that came from Rome. I also immediately started working in the Barrio La Moran. And this is where I'll linger most of our conversation, which I'll try to be brief, because it's been such a personal path of growth, of opening ideas about what city comprises, as well as trying to contribute to a larger discourse about participation in the city. So the Barrio La Moran was my first point of departure. My uncle, who's down here, had been working in La Moran for many years with the Habilitación Física de Barrios, which was a project started in the 90s. And here I am with a group from the Central University of students in 2009, that really began a kind of a line of inquiry that continues to this day. We then had a commission from CAF to begin studying, because of our work at the university, in an exhibition that I put together thereafter with the school, the Colegio de Arquitectos, which is sort of like the AIA equivalent, found funding to do an extensive research, a survey, land survey, a census, and we configured several projections that had to do with land, sort of waste management, and building resilience. We only were able to do one small plaza, which was funded by the Dividendo Voluntario para la Comunidad, and then the whole project stopped very abruptly. It was a long story, but we did do this one public space as a way to sanitize a huge dump of waste. And was the beginning of that, I didn't know it then, but of a huge advocacy for public spaces in barrios. I also wanted to better document what was in fact a barrio in the city. In this book, Gaba, which came out in 2015, and the editors on the registry is Fundación Espacio, actually, has been a very important kind of contribution to the cartography of the city, where all of these territories were really not fully documented. But not only did we kind of bring the maps to the 2014 conditions, we showed how they had evolved over time, which is what you can see here, like from the 60s all the way to 2014. And this is a compilation of all the barrios that formed that publication. And it proved that half of Caracas's residents live in barrios. And this statistic being so impactful really brought attention to it, and I think started eliciting from a larger audience of the beginning of a different way to consider the barrios, not as something other, marginal, but beginning to accept and realize and even just acknowledge that this is part of the city. We also had exhibitions, this is at the Galpones Los Chorros, where we also made an effort to bring school children who, by seeing kind of where they lived and relationship to nearby barrios, it's a really interesting aspect about Caracas is that the barrios are not just divided in north and south the way they might be in Bogota or in Santiago de Chile, but they're very much mixed because they occupy creeks that traverse the city. So a lot more salt and peppered than other cities. Another important research aspect that we embarked on was through the Wheelwright Fellowship, as I mentioned, the beginning of Pure Space. I visited all these places and emerged from that really with a huge conviction that public space made a difference in terms of their insertion, acknowledgement, integration into the larger city with a series of strategies for funding and for just formal strategies that I'm listing here. And in total, the project actually documents 23 projects. And here's, it's both in Spanish and in English. The drawings are very critical in sort of being able to explain how these pieces operate within a larger context of the city. And they all have a map, a project plan, and an axonometric, or a 3D representation, a perspective view. We then finally kind of had the opportunity to start doing these operations for real. We were invited by an NGO in Caracas to form part of a group with funding from Citibank Venezuela, and developed strategies to encourage participation, not through kind of lectures and boring sitting workshops, but through games, playing, theater, which proved to be very successful in kind of encouraging more and more people to participate. And even just the way that the public spaces, which were always a consensus with the community, this one's in La Palomera, and we continued to work in La Palomera from this point onward. This particular space had been a waste collection area for 30 years. And the very process of building a new public space in it is something that we would do with the very participation of the kids mostly, who had a lot to benefit from it. There's a school right next door who before would have to traverse this waste area to get to a basketball court that's just to the right of this image. A lot of really interesting things happened too, because the community kind of appropriated this themselves. You see here a slide and the chapel or the capillita in the back that are not part of the project as we conceived of it. It's been further developed by the community themselves, showing to what extent they feel a sense of ownership over it. We've done all sorts of public space interventions, very modest, always with very little means. And those were in La Palomera. This one's in Chapellín, where Andres Galarraga's from. As Henry mentioned, we're big on baseball. And if you come to Chapellín, almost everybody is Andres Galarraga's cousin. And it's not just an expression, it is for real. There was actually an amazing man here called Jorge Sumaca. The plaza is named after him, who had a school of baseball in the barrio for a number of years. Our main focus now is really advocacy. I find that a big frontier to overcome is just prejudice and discrimination against the fact that you've grown up in a barrio. And this is really problematic since, as I mentioned, half of the population lives here. So we've created kind of an extensive group, always growing, of artists and people from the community and journalists and educators and landscape and architects that we've embarked on a kind of a culture and artistic program, first with the support of the US Embassy in Venezuela, that we've continued, thankfully, with other supports now more recently from the Swiss Embassy and the French Embassy. But it began as a huge program to highlight all the things that go on, all the things that have created the identity of the barrio, which need to be recognized as part of the hybrid culture of Venezuela, which is, yes, heavy in the modern tradition and an amazing repertoire of modern architecture for sure. But there's also this component of the barrio that is rich in its own right. Music's amazing, dancing, and a lot of knowledge about plants, for example, as well. So a manifesto to the complete city written by Cho Carvajal was pronounced in the Plaza Bolivar by two very well-known actors in Caracas. And it states many things, but some that I love the most are, asking what does the barrio need? And, assuming that it needs everything because it isn't beautiful or ordered enough and does need to be intervened. The barrio is neither sick nor a disease. What does it need? It needs recognition. Continuing to think of the barrio as an urban malaise does not help understand it as an active part of the city. So I'm going to quickly move through these images. Bolas Criollas is something that you can find in La Palomera. There are 3 such courts. You will not find one in any public space in the kind of, quote, modern formal part of the city. And we also put together various celebrations and ways to feature things that were happening. So dancing, the traditional dances were taught by a group of dancers in the schools. We also had an event to recognize what the founders had done themselves, the plants that grow in different gardens, and a tour of the gardens, which are incredible. We built this large 1 to 200 scale and metric that was part of the Cross of May celebration, and a procession that came up to the top where we gathered and spoke with the founders of the barrio about the history of the barrio. It kind of captured in this image of the procession from the Bolivar Square up to the top, where we celebrated the Cross of May with music. Then this was systematized 1 year ago in an exhibition. I love this newspaper, which is part of the exhibition, that's full of good news about things that happen in the barrio. The gardens featured as a portrait with each garden owner, and then all the species. This is part of what we will present at the biennial this summer. 260 species that grow in the La Palomera and what they're used for, how you care for them. It's enabled us to actually intervene physically. For example, the waste collection has always been very precarious, kind of a container at the foot of the barrio that differentiates the quality of the service tremendously between the, let's say, formal urbanizations and the informal ones. So with Fospuca, which is the company in the city of Baruta, we started a year ago this door-to-door collection in order to be able to ultimately rid the entrances of this barrio, and I hope many more, of these kinds of ways of, not acknowledging this as part of the city. So a couple of months ago, we finally got rid of that container and replaced it with planters, which the neighbors donated a lot of the plants, the palmeras, and a space that had been abandoned for a long time right at the hinge that the community asked us to help them sort of envision what we could do with it. Opened some doors, curated a bit of the spontaneous vegetation, and made a celebration out of it that has been the beginning of reconsidering the structure for art and culture. Contemporary dancers, and then a lot of dancing at the end of the celebration as well. That was in October of 2019. And this is that structure, which with funding from the French and Swiss embassies, we're slowly transforming into a space, but already using it. And for example, we discovered a theater group in La Palomera that put on a performance with social distancing just a couple of weeks ago. And of course, this garden that we will continue to curate. So now to finish, I've only been in Miami for, as Neil mentioned, a couple of months, really looking forward to understanding and how to contribute to the city further. But when we think of Miami as the capital of Latin America, and I quote here Néstor García Canclini out of his book, Hybrid Culture, where he kind of, acknowledges, yes, Miami's position as capital of Latin American culture and this hybridization and North Americanization of Latin America that has occurred through United States influences for various different reasons. Henry mentioned, for example, oil and what that suscitated in the case of Venezuela. But my thought is that now there's an opportunity for the reverse to happen. And that's what I'm really looking forward to in my time here, is to bring this understanding of acknowledgement to communities and to a larger audience in Miami that has serious issues, acknowledging itself as complete with communities that have been disenfranchised historically, and even under political scenarios currently, not too terribly acknowledged either. So perhaps some South Americanization can happen here in the North, which is something that I would really be excited to form a part of. And so, yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Elisa. That was beautiful. Let's move on. Camilo, would you like to share your screen? Thank you so much, Elisa. That was amazing. So if you could yeah, okay.
You see the screen?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, my name is Camilo Rosales. I've been with FIU for quite some time now. I will not talk as much of me, although I'll have a little segment at the end. I'll go into the Miami experience and the American experience as well. So in the past, it's well known that identities were closely tied to place. And this is very common in European surnames. We have Da Vinci, De Lesseps, Unamuno, Van Dyck, all this, that, then, van, born, of, at, all mean from or of. Sometimes we're land-based nobilities, sometimes we're just people from a certain place. Of course, things have changed quite a bit. The identity of the United States is very different. Actually, it is different even than parts of South America or the world. It has a different way to appreciate that. Today, there's more restless in the idea of belongingness. In part is due to a higher mobility and globalization. Identities tend to be layered, multidimensional, naturally in flux, and less tied to place. We all have, as we move, different identities. We carry our own and add new ones. In my country, they will ask you, what is your last name? I come from a small country, Nicaragua. I was there till I was 17, then came to study here in the United States and basically stay here. I've been back and forth to other places, but mainly been in this country. Not in Miami, actually. I'm not new to Miami, but this was my last movement within the United States. In a small country, they ask your name because they can spot you immediately to a family group, to a location, and a number of things go along with that. More common in other countries is where are you from? And this has been, of course, natural. It still happens today. But in the United States, it's more common to ask you, where are you originally from? Because everyone moves. American families move quite a bit. And so even in Miami, which has been an extreme, even in other places other than Miami, people are not exactly from there. But lately, where do you live is the real American question, because it says a lot of things. The United States and the cities especially are cities of zones, are completely fragmented. The zoning is to protect land values, but it also locates people by economy status, what they can pay, how much land they can have. And depending on that is where your kids are going to school, who do you socialize with? And so where do you live is extremely important in a consumerist society, because they can spot all the ingredients that come around the idea of ownership, including, of course, apartments. And you see in Miami very clearly the zones of commercial, because in my pointer, Coral Gables and Dadeland. And then the various neighborhoods, all of which are different and have different economic strata, different economic standing. This is quite dramatic. For instance, some areas like Coconut Grove, which is one of the oldest communities in Miami. It was originally basically Black and white African Americans and white Anglos. The African American community have remained and has actually grown quite a bit with new influx, Haitians, Bahamians, and a number of Caribbeans, while the white Anglo population has actually in part fled, while in a new group of newcomers, basically a lot of Latin Americans, Cubans first, came to replace some of those white Anglos that have left. But see the drama of space here, in which you see very clearly the demarcation of Coconut Grove from West Grove. And it's just the amount of plants. Even the parcel will not necessarily be much bigger, especially in the fringes between the two communities. But the landscape is radically different. It tells you completely different story of how we live, how we identify ourselves with the environment. In one relatively well-cared or very well-cared gardens using the old canopy of Miami, whereas the other one is hard to keep. You need watering, you need upkeep, and the poorer, stable communities of the original group that came to Miami has remained to be poor. And so people with less mobility and people with more mobility and wealth. And this is in two adjacent neighborhoods. So identity in this country is mostly by location. Where do you live? Not where you're from, where do you live? Belonging is mostly by association. Who do you socialize with? What do you eat at home? Where do you work? And these are more intimate questions that are not necessarily asked all the time. Miami, more than a city, really is a collection of projects and deeply fragmented zones and neighborhoods. This is in part because of zoning, but in part because of this economic allocations of people that sometimes has to do with ethnicity as well. So sprawl, cars, and air conditioning together with zoning has contributed to an extremely weak public and pedestrian realm in Miami. And when you see in an aerial photograph, the communities in Miami, it's kind of crazy. Each one is doing his own thing, disconnected. No public transportation, very little public realm. It's just the ideal American dream of owning a property, owning a home. The American dream is just made in this extensive, immensely big landscape where identities are tailored by economic status. And so Miami can be seen actually in many different ways. There are many different Miamis. The natives, which is about 20% of the population, which, as I said, originally was half and half, Black and whites. Today, that white group has in part left the city, whereas the Black has grown some. The natives tend to be actually the poorest. Most blue-collar work comes from that group. Then there are temporary migrants, which are agricultural workers, mostly from Mexico, about 5%. The exiles, which I'm going to talk more about them, is a different group, but with the mentality that is to return home. They are here temporarily in general, at least part of this group, and it's pretty large, about 30%. Then there's another group that is like in between, what I can call upward moving professionals. The need to achieve the loyalties to work, not so much centered in community, but more centered into themselves, their careers, 10%. Tend to be younger, and these are the doctors, the engineers, the architects, and perhaps some of us, professors, mobile. We are not necessarily tied to a place, but we decide to stay in Miami, although we could relocate, live someplace else. And then there's another group that I'm calling mobiles. These people have home some other place. Miami is just a second home. They're looking for amenities, weather, they come here in winter, or work, or leisure, or just in shopping. About 25%, there's a lot of people. They have land ownership or property ownership in Miami, but they don't live here permanently. And then the tourists, which are the most transient, look for leisure and pleasure, about 10% of that. And these numbers change quite a bit. They're in constant flux. It depends on the month of the year. It depends on the year itself. And so these numbers are always and constantly moving. And then you can say there's a virtual Miami, which is not the population per se, but yes, it does have participation. It's out there in a virtual reality of sorts, in which commodities are sold. There's a wall of images, and Miami has much of that because of much of this group is really transient. If you check the first group, which is relatively stable, is 20%, and the transient group is 80%. How can you make a city like that? And it's been said that this is the future of cities, regardless. Large cities will be more and more like this. And so you have the first group, live in small houses. They do not necessarily share neighborhoods with others. They have remained fairly poor, although this is much better than many other countries, especially in South America. Poverty can get to much deeper levels. Then the farm workers live south with agriculture. This group of partially undocumented, partially they stay, some actually return, and is an unstable group by all means. Then the exiles, which has been a very large group, in this case, mostly represented by Cubans, which came in very large numbers and still become a large group of this city. And we remember Calle Ocho, which has been like the Fifth Avenue of this community of sorts, in the sense of importance and what we remember of the community. And this group is different. They live in Miami, but think of the homeland. They still participate in the politics, in the sports, in the events, in the festivities. They are not completely American yet. Actually, only half of them become American, and they don't become assimilated. And I can say some Venezuelans as well, which is a large group, and Nicaraguans in my own country. They all participate in like a reverberation in the mother country. They are not completely here. They are here only temporarily, at least in their minds, although they may stay here a lifetime. Brazilians as well. And then you have the sports following. Haitians will be doing festivities like Carnival. And so they are attached. It's a tethering connection with the homeland. The exiles are very peculiar from that point. They are not completely assimilated. They remain within the communities. These are the upward moving professional, which actually happened everywhere in Miami. I'm showing the picture of Brickell because it's a concentration of them. In this case, they tend to be younger. And as I said, they are here loyal to work. And they are not so community driven as the group that we said are in the older exiles. And then finally, the mobiles, which is an immense group that only live here part of the time. They own property, in most cases, apartments and condominiums, and the idea is that they can lock and leave. They also have houses, about 20%, but the great majority has this enormous portion of real estate. The tourists are pleasure seekers, and then of course it's sun and sand and hotels, mostly in good parts of South Miami, Miami Beach, South Beach especially. And of course, this is about nightlife, food, and this great concentration there where they will go. And finally, the virtual Miami, and this map shows you Miami with my pointer here, so close to a whole continent down south, 500 million people, extraordinary, and linked also in all manners of ways via communication. This is a fiber optic map telling you Miami not only geographically close, but also incredibly tied with the rest. And that world, is a world of bragging, publicity. It's so Miami, and then represent the side of Miami, of course, that want to be consumed by those that come here. The coconut is not actually an original fruit from Miami, but well, this is what is native or what people expect to be. Sun, beauty, beautiful women, and the beach, or Art Deco, and of course, the extraordinary colors of Miami. And he goes on and on to sell the city. But the thing is that in Miami, so many immigrants that you feel at home by default. Everyone seems to be in the same transient boat. The dominant culture, which normally is established Americans and in good parts that have been Protestant, white Anglo-Saxons, is not necessarily dominant here anymore. The dominant culture, just by numbers, was established by recent settlers. And assimilation is not essential. You can live in this city and actually some good numbers do not even speak English. It feels foreign. Miami can feel foreign, like it was some other part and not the United States. But it's not true at all. You'll see how it works in the other way. So the question I ask myself is, what does identity has to do with architecture? It is tied to architecture when the culture is vernacular, when things were not moving, when people were established, but not anymore. As people move, you cannot be changing architecture as you move along. The truth is architecture becomes the other, the culture that you go into. And if you have the case of Miami Beach. And so other than the Art Deco district or Mediterranean Coral Gables, which sponsor particular architectural style, most of Miami is similar to other Florida cities, really. Or new enclaves in the southern part of the United States. Miami is not unique, architecturally speaking. The majority of Miami architecture is not local. And you can see this in Miami. This is Fort Lauderdale. And this is in Tampa. And this is Palm Beach. And this is St. Petersburg. So they all look similar. Coastline, extensive, this boxy apartment buildings. And the composition has some similarities as well. Even the poor neighborhoods, you can say that this building could be in Miami or it could be in Atlanta. Even in independent homes, this is northern Miami Beach, but this is San Antonio, Texas. And so there are no identity strictly related to architecture, or not as much. And this is even California. This is an African-American neighborhood that happens to be rather affluent in Los Angeles. So what does make this sort of, if not uniqueness, what identifies Miami more from the point of view of the environment? And so identity, I think, is compounded by atmospheric effects, landforms, coastal settings, waterways, landscapes, plant species, very important, densities, signage, color, food, occasional extravagances, and public art. Not so much architecture, but attached to architecture. And so a sunset like this, or sunrise actually, it will not happen in Boston so easily, or even Northern Canada, or parts of Europe. I mean, it's just this thing, Miami, flatness, tropical. It's got a special atmosphere. This is the North End in Boston, where was originally an English enclave. Then it was replaced by the Irish, very well-known fact. The Fitzgeralds come from there, where the Kennedy family is attached to. And then came Greeks and Jews, and lately Italians. So what changed was not the architecture, but the signage. So you got Café Little Italy in the French, in the North End in Boston, with an English style, brownstone as it's called, which happens to be close to Ireland as well. But this is Little Italy, New York. No longer, the center it was for Italians. It has been gentrified quite a bit. The buildings still remain there. There were commercial buildings before Italians arrived, or maybe while Italians were there. But they are the same buildings that you have in Chinatown next door. And it's just the signage that makes Chinatown. Of course, the sounds, the smells, all these things go along. But architecturally speaking, not so much so. Even in Miami, you got Calle Ocho again, and we got the great two restaurants of Miami, La Carreta and Versailles. in half of the words are in English. And the architecture could be many other places, except, of course, the landscape in the palm trees that Miami sells so well. More important, perhaps, is the little ventanita. This is the little window where they say coffee in as a side business of restaurant. But this is very Latin stuff. That would be a contribution, you may say. But other than that, it's not that much. Of course, signage is important, but this is Calle Ocho. And you get the in-chain stores, Ahi Sushi Bar and the H&R Block that happens to have the next name in Spanish, Taxes y Más. In other words, taxes and more. And then flamingos, which are not necessarily from Miami, or they've been extinct, but this is what we sell. And then palm trees. But then again, it's in English. So it's more hybridization than what we think. And the architecture not necessarily following along as being totally different. But as said, there's no escape from other ideas. This is a place in Texas called Piedras Negras on the left-hand side, and Eagle Pass on the right-hand side. And there's a big difference between these two countries at the borderline. You see the left as being kind of informal, very, very, very dense. Even from the air, it looks disorganized. The right, it looks greener, far more clear. And so how come? Because there are mechanisms that are extraordinarily important in making the American identity that also invades Miami. Miami, like most of the United States, is a highly normative environment imposed by what we call the dictatorship of the majority. That's democracy. This is in the manner of norms and codes, which regulate completely the built environment. The legal and financial systems are incredibly important. How you get a loan, how you have to satisfy the loan, insurance, infrastructural works, and real estate conventions. And the conventions of real estate are far more powerful than what we think. The realtors don't know much about styles. And so they sort of push people to do certain things that sell, because selling is the name of the game in this country. And so you even have the way the natural environment is opposed to the man-made environment. This is in the case of Homestead and the Everglades on the left and Homestead agriculture on the right. The grid comes along immediately, a normative process that starts making everything fit into it, including architectural patterns, and then it comes into the cities themselves. I'm using my pointer here. And then this is downtown El Paso in Texas. This could be downtown almost anywhere. Parts of Houston, Texas, most new cities, parts of Miami Beach, parts of Miami. This is all made. It's an extraordinary force that make you conform, whether you like it or not, and produce some kind of sameness as well. I'm going to make now a little point about my architecture, myself. Not much of it. I'm going fast. I stay with the 15 minutes that Neil asked us to do, so I'm going to finish within that. I'm from Nicaragua, and I studied all my education here, or most of it, in the United States. First in Texas, then I went to Harvard as well. And I worked in New York for a number of years, worked for Arquitectonica in Miami, IFA in New York, SOM. And then when I came to Miami, I found it kind of different. This is my country, which is a land of volcanoes. I'm showing you, a beautiful picture of the country, which it is. And it has a fantastic nature, and it's very poor. And I'm not showing you the difficulties, socially speaking, and the terrible politics. So in Latin America, we have our share of that. But the country is astonishingly beautiful. I moved to a city when I was 11, I left home. And this is not the view exactly, but close to where I was with the Jesuits in high school. A volcano had exploded, and then that debris made hundreds of islands, which are there. And so I got used to this extraordinary landscape, so varied, in a small land, but it didn't look small at all, because all the pleats and curves and twists and going up and down made the country much larger, actually. And this is the city where I studied. My school was on a cliff, and it was made of concrete in a modern school, but this is a beautiful city of Granada, a colonial city. And this is more the area where I grew up next to the coffee plantations. My parents were involved in that business. And it's a very, I would say, interesting country of constant variation. So I sided with something I call spatial transparency and the organization of native landscapes as a way to relate architecture with the local environment. For me, what is local is the natural, is landforms and plant species and so on. I had something that connected to my country. When I came to Miami, it was so flat, so commercialized. And then in time, I've been enjoying more of the city in many, many respects, but especially the landscape and not the commercial side of the coastline, but the Everglades. I found it fascinating that in that extraordinary flatness was so much variation. I call that a landscape of inches. In those inches, when the ground goes up just a bit, you have something called a hammock, which is a collection of nature that comes up drier than the wet prairie. And then you have all kinds of plants and animal life. So I said to myself, how silly it is that Miami only look at the beach when they could have looked behind them at this landscape. So when I designed my house, which is in black here, I said, well, what development did in Miami was to get rid of nature almost completely. We were obliterating the islands of trees, the Everglades, everything that went on its way. Why not thinking that that could have continued and the city could have grown within nature? And so I thought of my house, why not having a house within a hammock? And that I called a hammock house. That was my own, which is what I did. And actually built it this way. I created the hammock. There was a barren land. All these trees are actually planted by me. And then I even did the plans in which trees and architecture were intertwined in some kind of field, which is what you have here. This is the plan of the house. And then these clumps of trees are all very fairly well studied to create various environments in relatively medium-sized local land. And so from the outside, the layering and porosity continues on from the garden. And so in that sense, I was linking my early experience with my new experience. And this is the house now that has this sort of collection of spaces within the spaces, behind spaces, behind spaces. So spatial transparency, which is, as I said, something that I've been exploring, appeals to a sense of connectivity and continuity through visually linked intermediate spaces, incorporating permeability, layering, and porosity. And I've done that on a few other projects. I just have, this one is in Managua. This has a different story because it's more of a hybrid between the native culture there and modern architecture. But I use the same idea of layering. Architecture this way converses, corresponds, or recalls the attributes of natural surroundings as a means to connect with them and bring them home. And this is, another project I did in Costa Rica, in which the proportion of the building has to do with the proportion of the trees. The canopy of the trees is followed with the roofs. And so the interior, which is open, is just this continuity in which the landscape passes through. When the forest opens up, then you have this extraordinary, beautiful landscape in which you actually observe and, you may say, live within nature. So this is it. My presentation is kind of small. I'm going to stop my share, and I'm going to allow the next person to go with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Camilo. That was extraordinarily insightful. I'd like to invite Glenda to share her screen. Glenda, welcome.
Yes, hello, Neil. Thank you. So thank you once again, Neil, for the invitation to present in this great series. I'm really happy to be here, and it's a pleasure to speak after these amazing presentations that we've seen today. As Neil mentioned in the beginning, I am from Ecuador. I was born and raised there. Ecuador is a place where night and day are equally long due to its location on the equator, 12 hours each. The population is currently 17 million people, and the borders include the Pacific Ocean to the west, Colombia to the north, and Peru to the south and to the east. Ecuador was originally part of La Gran Colombia. We saw a map in Henry's presentation that included this region, and it also included part of Panama. And so you can see here, that's why we have very similar flags. And they moved to the United States in the year 2000 as part of an exodus of about 600,000 people that migrated between 2000 and 2004. In my case, the move was not a decision I made on my own, but one my parents made for me. I need to backtrack a little bit and explain what the country was going through in the late 90s. First of all, the political scenario was concerning. We had 4 different presidents in a span of 4 years. As you can see, Ecuador had a woman president, but she was in office only for 3 days. In 1997, 1998, these were tough years due to El Niño, which is an environmental phenomenon caused by the warming of the Pacific Ocean near the equator, and this produces torrential rains. So this left thousands of people displaced, homeless, and the devastation was valued at almost $3,000 million. So by 1999, due to the environmental disasters, the political unrest, and skyrocketing inflation, Ecuador was in its worst economic crisis in history. It was a very dark moment for a lot of people, unfortunately, who lost their savings because major banks started to go bankrupt. So on January 2000, the then president changed the currency from the sucre to the dollar, the US dollar. And this was a decision that actually cost him the presidency soon after. And this has been the official currency in Ecuador to this day, the US dollar. Unfortunately, this caused many more banks to collapse, and the situation resulted in a coup d'etat that I remember watching on TV with my mother. I didn't know at that time, but my parents had already decided to migrate in search of a better future for my sister and I. And to be frank, this was an easy process for us because my father was born in the States. So we moved in 2000 from Guayaquil, the city where I was born, to the Miami metropolitan area. At first, I thought Miami was a very different place compared to my hometown in Ecuador. The cities are almost 2,000 miles apart. That's a little bit over 3,000 kilometers. And on the surface, they could appear very different. But as time went by and I grew older, I realized that there were also a lot of similarities. In terms of the geography, for example, both cities are surrounded by a lot of water and delicate natural ecosystems. Like in the case of South Florida, the Everglades, and in Guayaquil, the manglares, which means mangroves. Also, both cities were founded near riverbanks. Both cities are not capitals. Guayaquil is not the capital of Ecuador, and Miami is not the capital of Florida, even though both cities are important economic drivers for their regions, as they are both port cities. Longitudinally, the cities are almost in perfect alignment. And going back in time to the origins of the name of the cities, both names derive from indigenous people or tribes. There is also similarity in the built social and economic environment of the downtown, where some indications of inequality are perceived. And it's in these similarities that I can find the root of some of my preoccupations as an architect. For example, the two regions, being so delicate in nature due to their geographic locations, Both are constantly threatened by natural disasters like torrential rain and flooding on any given day. This is from last week in Guayaquil. So I'm constantly reminded about what is important, and I've inevitably been shaped into an architect that feels responsible for the care of people, of the planet, and also its resources, both natural and economic. So we'll briefly show just two small installation projects to speak further about some of these social, economic, and environmental preoccupations and how I interweave my Miamian and Latin American identity into these projects. These two installations were conceived, they're obviously ephemeral in nature as they're installations and small in scale, but they're conceived as explorations where I can test concepts very quickly, and then I can apply these ideas to larger projects. These were installations open to the public near one another in downtown Miami and in Brickell. And the first one was a multi-sensory experience and site-specific installation for seating and lounging, part of a 4-day multi-artist exhibition, which took place in a 5,000 square foot raw space in Brickell City Center, organized by Raw Pop-Up and curated by Tam Green. The exhibition required all the installations to use scaffolding as the main building material, as an ode to Miami, which is a city eternally under construction. The exhibition theme was hard versus soft, and also called for contrast and juxtaposition. So another material that was required was foam. The scaffolding, the foam, and a budget of $600 was provided, and there were no other size or material limitations. But the curator suggested our choice of additional materials should be something that would identify us. So I immediately thought of weaving my Latin American heritage in the piece through this addition of materials. The first material I thought of was corrugated metal, because it is commonly found in Latin America and also here in the US. And it represents the harsh reality of Latin American countries, in a way, the poverty, informal construction, economic inequality, which is unfortunately an everlasting issue in Latin America, as we've seen in previous presentations. And to contrast that, I selected roses, because not only are they physically soft, but the Ecuadorian rose is also a symbol of economic prosperity and richness in natural resources, which most Latin American countries have. And roses is something that Ecuadorians are immensely proud of. So it held both this physical aspect and also conceptually. And I limited my choice of additional materials to these two in order to reduce post-exhibition waste, considering the exhibition only lasted 4 days. And it was important for me also to pick materials that could be reusable, recyclable, or biodegradable. In addition to the material requirements, the piece had to fulfill a function. And this was a lottery. I got a pavilion to sit, lounge, and socialize. And so considering we had only 2 weeks to put it together and then only 2 days to dismantle, the structure is a simple cube-like frame. At the bottom, catwalk pieces are lined with the foam, and they act as benches. And at the top, the frame was covered with corrugated metal to hide the flowers. So when the visitors approach the piece, they do not see what's inside. It isn't until you're very close that the roses reveal themselves. And the pavilion measures roughly 8 feet by 10 feet by 10 feet. And so it's purposely compact too, to evoke ideas about respect towards context and scale of surroundings, density, open space, and sustainability. It also appears to float, to promote the idea that buildings ought to carefully and delicately meet the ground to allow for the site's terrain to breathe and permeate. As we know that if we don't, this is why we have so many floods after heavy rains. And this is a view from the interior of the piece. The roses hang perpendicularly as a reference to the way the sun shines on the equator. And there is no roof to allow views through. And what you see in the distance is the underside of the existing slab in the raw event space. These are some of the reactions, lots of photos, wonder, and interaction. And this diagram explains a bit of the process and reflects a Latin American nature in some ways, starting with the materials that were subsidized, as many things in Latin America, and family and friends who lent a hand in the construction were paid with food, which is commonly known as mingas in Ecuador. And I tracked the cost of the materials and even paid for some carbon credits for the transportation of the roses, and still managed to make a decent profit percentage. So this proves that projects do not have to create a lot of waste or spend a lot of money in order to be a success. The second installation is very much tied to Miami and its history, and shows something that I strive towards in all of my projects, and that is to reveal an authentic connection to the history of the site. Miami doesn't have history is a statement I hear quite often. And I know it's not true, but I can understand why the public would think this, as history is something that's not accessible to all if it is mainly housed in a museum. So one day doing research about downtown Miami, I encountered some amazing archive material, like these photos on the left, a press release advertising a new office building in downtown with air conditioning. And on the right, a Christmas event on the street in 1950. This is Flagler Street, which is the main street in downtown, right outside the famous Bourdain's flagship store. You can see the sign cropped here on the left margin. So when a call for artists for another exhibition stated that the exhibition would take place in the abandoned Bourdain building during Miami Art Week, I knew that this was a great opportunity to connect people with place and with the history of Miami. And so developed in collaboration with Ariane Corey, who's a curator based in New York, and the History Miami Museum Research Center, based in downtown Miami. This installation, titled Miami Pop-Up Archive, allowed visitors to dig through copies of real archive material to spark interest in Miami's architectural history and induce nostalgia. The installation took place in an office area within the abandoned floor level that the exhibition occupied, and it spread over 3 existing cubicles, office cubicles. The installation included 2 research cubicles equipped with tables, stools, and office-related items, where visitors could spend time looking through the archive and reference material. The Bourdain's building had been recently abandoned during the time the exhibition took place and was in danger of demolition. So the 3rd cubicle was different than the research cubicle. This was an invitation for visitors to reflect on Miami's past and present and express their thoughts actually through this writing of the postcards, their thoughts regarding the future of the building, to address a constant debate that exists in Miami, which is this question of preserve or demolish, and this debate between development and preservation. So Miami doesn't have history. The statement I often heard had no place in any of the nights of the exhibition. Once again, considering the temporary nature of the installation, all the materials were reusable and recyclable. And really, people were having more fun than we could have expected looking through all of the material. To conclude, Miami is the capital of Latin America, and I always thought the word capital meant capital city. But I think that today we can also understand the word in economic terms, as this interesting picture found in the Bourdain's archive suggests. The sign reads, "Welcome Latin Americans. If you don't speak English, please ask an interpreter who will help you for free." Thank you.
Thank you, Glenda. That was beautiful. We're going to move straight on to Alfredo for the final presentation. We might not have too many questions at the end, but my point is this is just the beginning of a conversation, not the end. So we're seeing actually a wonderfully Latin American display, beautiful, colorful presentations, but very Latin American in that we have 15 minutes, but 15 Latin American minutes, which are kind of expandable, elastic. Time is elastic in Latin America. I'm always reminded of the comment that Hernandez Alonso makes that LA means late again, and LA, Latin America, LA, or whatever. But it's fine. It's beautiful presentation. So anyway, Alfredo, please welcome.
Hello, everyone. I'm gonna turn off my camera because I'm having some issues with internet. Let me share my. So I call a presentation today "Under the Asphalt" in Latin America, and I start with a story. The first time I came to the U.S., I came with my brother, and I was standing on above the asphalt in Houston, waiting for the bus. We didn't know buses take so long. But a person arrived in a car that looks Mexican, and he asked us in Spanish, perfect Spanish, "Where are you going?" And so we told him downtown. Say, "I take you." And so we jump into the car, and I asked him, "Where are you from?" And he said, "Here." And I asked, "Where are your parents from?" And he said, "Here." And he said, "My grandparents, we're a very big family. We're all from here." And then he asked us, where are you guys going? And we said, "To California." And he told us, "California, you're gonna eat a lot of burritos in California. But that food is not Mexican food. That food is the food of the natives." It took me around 10 years to realize that the small encounter was real, that in Mexico, really, there is no burritos. Is really native California food. So there is something interesting, like next to the asphalt, you can see like the grass, and there are all kinds of species in there. There is something interesting that all kinds of species around the planet, as they move through the planet, they develop genetic evolution. They change. For example, ants. There are 14,000 species of ants around the world. But us, we're the Homo sapiens, we're practically the same. So these guys, these Homo sapiens that went 45,000 years ago to Europe, and these other ones, 15,000 years to America, they develop different cultures. And the way that we adapt to our environment is through cultural evolution, not through genetic evolution. So in this 1500, this is a book of the Aztecs, one of the few books that survive, that shows the arrival of Cortés into Tenochtitlan. Here is Cortés, and here is the girlfriend that Cortés had that did the translation for the Spaniards. But more interesting in the first arrival are actually the other expedition. There is one, the Narvaez Expedition, around 15 years after Cortés arrived to Tenochtitlan, that brought 600 Spaniards to Florida through Hispaniola, Havana, and it arrived in Tampa. There were 600 Spaniards, and they could not survive in the environment of North America. Only 3 survived. Like one of the first landing trips in Tampa was a 10-day trip that they barely made it, and the natives in the region were very pacific. They give them food, they give them water on the way. So only 3 survived. One of them is Cabeza de Vaca, that wrote a book, La Relación. So this trip took around 8 years. So when he came back to Spain, he was a sensation. And there he describes, like, basically America was divided between 2 type of natives. The one that is green, there was an agricultural society that was very pacific, but as soon as you pass the Mississippi, there's a hunter-gatherer. There were millions of bison, so they live where the bison live, and they were more aggressive. So this was the America that doesn't appear in the architectural history classes. This was Louisiana, this was Tennessee, this was Georgia, this was Florida, this was called Toltec in Arkansas, this Aztlan in Wisconsin, and this is one of the biggest one, Cahokia in Illinois. There was a city of 60,000 people, a population that bigger than Florence at the time, and the United States did not have this population until middle of the 1800s in Philadelphia. So this is Cahokia today, flanked with asphalt, and next to Chapo's Tires and Tienda El Magüey. And this was the pottery, what the culture developed. Like, for example, there was a deep relationship. There was really no divide between the Aztec culture the Mesoamerican culture, it really expanded all the way to Canada. So this was there was a relationship always with the animal. In this case, like the whole Mississippi culture, there was a relationship with the snake, the horn snake. So the colonialists arrived too with a relationship with biology. They brought in the cattle, the chicken, the horse, the dogs, and they start, you can see here, chasing the bison. This was Florida in 1859, the same year that Charles Darwin published The Origins of Species. So you can see the Lake Okeechobee. That was it's really the Miami lake. It was the Miami culture living in here. And so you can see the Okeechobee Lake naturally drain through the Everglades into the ocean. But this world that Charles Darwin saw of the origins of species, of natural selection, lasted about 20 years. Around 1880, one person from Philadelphia bought practically the entire South Florida. It's the biggest land deal in the history of humankind. And he developed the idea that he wanted to sell this land as agriculture. So he developed this plan for draining the lake. The lake that was called today Lake Okeechobee. And he was successful. Governor Broward in the 1910s, in the early 1900s, he developed the plan. And this is where we live today, in this grid of 1 mile by 1 mile that Camilo was talking about. And here is all the agricultural land that was created by the drainage of the Everglades. And this is where we live, in 1 mile by 1 mile. So all this was done with very basic industrial technology. So I did my doctoral degree in Berkeley. And my best friend, his name is Alonso Addison, when I was a student there. And his grandfather was Alonso Church, who was a professor of mathematics at Princeton and was the PhD advisor of Alan Turing. So I was doing the doctoral degree in the early 1990s when the whole industry of computing began to happen in the Bay Area. And I remember I went to one conference. It was not really a conference, it was the first seminar about nanotechnology. And people were already talking in that conference about the limitations of computing. The limitations at an atomic level, that you could not reduce the size of the instructions to kind of like an atomic level. And some people began to talk about that biology could do it. So I remember with my friend took me to his house, and he with his father was the director of the mathematics department in Berkeley. And I began to know a little bit the story of the milieu in which the thesis of Turing happened, and really was in a very particular time in Princeton, in which the Department of Mathematics was, there was Albert Einstein with John von Neumann, and that was the milieu of where kind of the field of computing emerged. Like really the computing is called the Church-Turing thesis. And one thing that I remember from this nanotechnology conference, I remember from the thesis of Turing with Church, is that really what happens with computing is that the thesis is like there were only two people in the world that were trying to answer a Gödel problem. It's like how you can do an infinite number of calculation with a machine. And Church developed the lambda system, and Turing developed the Turing machine, but the word particularly is basically a notation system to do calculations. So, but the Turing system is basically a tape. It's in the appendix of the thesis, and it's basically a tape, and you do one calculation at a time. Computers today can do it very fast, but it's one calculation at a time. But in this nano conference, people began to talk that really in nature, with the DNA, you can do billions of calculations at the same time. And we can see, like, for example, the human race, we work in around 20 terabytes of energy, and the whole nature is working around 90 terabytes. So I thought that this was something that was interesting, but then I began to hear that biology is going to move faster than computing, and I wasn't. I really didn't see evidence until in 2016 when I went to actually an ACSA conference in San Francisco, and in one afternoon there was going to be the final speech was going to be by shop architects in the Mission District. And very close to there, I have a friend that is a facilities manager, an architect facilities manager for UCSF. And he takes me to the UCSF campus. And it's a campus of like around 5 blocks by 10 blocks. And I knew UCSF. UCSF was just a medical hospital facility. And he took me through the labs. And this was not really a pipe dream anymore, but it was reality. And so, you began to see like it's a field that really was born in 2006, synthetic biology, and it began to look at really how nature it can really move matter at the atomic level. That's what a plant does. Like, for example, a plant just receives sun and grabs CO2 from the air, and transform it into glucose. And that's the cereal that we eat, the bread that we eat. So in 2006 is born with the BioBrick Foundation, is born the way of that we can edit living organisms. For example, we can change the color of the flies. We can bring back the fragrances of extinct hibiscus from Hawaii. This is from is a work from Ginkgo Bioworks, and also we already have edited babies. This is a Chinese researcher that did it. Now he's facing jail for 3 years. So we have developed culturally, but we are really basically the same Homo sapiens of 150,000 years ago. So the question began to be about culture, not about cultural evolution only, but about genetic evolution. So I began around 3 years ago with my students to begin to look at what are the impacts in the built environment that this could be done. So I met one of the 2 Alan Turings of synthetic biology with George Church. And I began to show them some of the ideas that I had that was developing with my students. And for example, one of the first ideas was to begin to think about what happened, for example, in the case of sea level rise, what could happen with land. And I began to see that most of the solution that people gave to sea level rise is just the same, doing again with concrete, steel, and wood, what caused the problem. And so he began to tell me that, for example, that we could do islands in 2 days. Like the whole bay is only 2 feet deep, 3 feet, 2 feet, 1 feet deep. This is where Steelville is. So you can walk. It looks like a big ocean, but really you can walk through it. And so if we create a circuitry of cyanobacteria actually is the organism that provides more, is really the creator of oxygens on Earth. There's a byproduct, which is when the cyanobacteria dies, it calcifies and generates these kinds of tone. This is stromatolites from a long time ago. So your church has a company called N-Evolve that already working with cyanobacteria, and there's another professor already in Colorado that already is working with cyanobacteria, and he has been able to make it alive for 30 days. There's another project in Newcastle about this. So we began to develop. I'm gonna go quickly through some of the projects that we have been working. So I began to work with students in a way to begin to ask really what does it mean, and what does it mean related to really kind of like, because there are two things. One of them is kind of like the medium or technology. Culture, is the culture really, is this culture really with the architectural history that we have from Europe? Or is something else? So as we develop on the projects, like we began to see there is a possibility of not only moving into buildings, but to moving into entire territories and moving into designing the body. For example, like one of the projects is about what related to, for example, like instead of eating proteins, how do we become photosynthetic beings? So I think it is related to kind of beginning to question about if really architectural history is a conspiracy theory, or if it is really the full truth, or what it is. So we also have a program in FIU in which we go to Japan, and is the culture shock with Japan is really felt on the skin, and really you begin to find surprising things. So for example, the Japanese they created their houses just with rice paper. There was no wall. In Japan, it gets very cold in winters and very hot in the summer. But the Japanese culturally developed this kind of party that they had to be kind of astronaut on Earth. There is no environmental system classes. Basically, the whole environmental system happen in, it's still called, you put two more, and if it's 2 more, you put 1 more, and then you regulate the temperature of your body here. There is no furniture in these places. So as we move along, we began to like questions on our student projects about the fragility of architecture, in which kind of condition we began to live. So these are student theses from this semester. They're not finished. These are just midterm work. So we began to like a question about how is kind of like our connection, our basic connection with the matter that is in front of us. So in the process, we think really maybe is a condition of fragility. In the end, like the images help us to look at the ways of looking at architecture, not as up. I mean, as we develop this project, we're not really sure that there are answers in there, but they're kind of like surprising reflections. For example, this project is one about a building that you can eat. It sounds like science fiction, but really like the same thing that the plant does, that grabs CO2, basically creates food out of thin air. By hacking it with synthetic biology, we can do it. So, for example, I put here a bunch of startups that are working on this, already have working products on this thing. So maybe one thing that we can begin to look at is that the reflection of the fragility will make us think, maybe make us doubt of all the certainty that architecture have built over time. And so maybe there is a mutism, like the word Miami. We really do not know what it means. We do not. We have nothing. We don't. It's completely under the asphalt. Most of the mounds in Florida are either covered by buildings or they are not digged out, and there is absolutely no way to see it. Miami is a native word, and whose word is very difficult to unleash. Miami in Nahuatl is the language of of Mesoamerica that cover all the Americas before colonization, all the North America and Central America before colonization. It means my Maya or my new Maya. Thank you.
Thank you, Alfredo. That was really beautiful. I'm kind of reminded, but there were two stories about asphalt when you started with asphalt. One is I was reminded of a presentation once I went to Elias Angelis, who gave a paper at a conference based on Rem Koolhaas's first year essay, would you believe? And I remember to this day, the opening line of that first year essay was, the city is a sea of tarmac with a few hot spots of urban intensity, which for a first year essay, I mean, incredible. But I'm also reminded of Benjamin, Walter Benjamin, who has this notion of the flaneur, of I guess the investigator, the detective, or whatever, botanizing in the asphalt. In other words, asphalt becomes a kind of somewhere that you need to kind of, in a way, rupture. And as he puts it, as a kind of social historian, one has to kind of redeem the buried fragments of civilization. And civilization he sees as an ongoing catastrophe, and it's the role of the social historian to redeem the buried fragments of those that have been crushed by history. So asphalt, I think, is an incredibly provocative concept to think about from a number of perspectives. We've got just 8 minutes left. I mean, these are fantastic presentations. I think, in a way, there was nothing more Latin American about this than the presentations themselves, in a way. It reminds me of Jaime Canavez. He was talking about movies, but really he was talking, it was amazing to get Jaime Canavez, and these were very Latin American with this kind of elastic notion of time, which is very beautiful. Each was 15 minutes, but 15 Latin American minutes. And we have time, maybe, I think possibly for one question. I don't know if we have any time for any more, but I just want to sort of open up to the audience if anyone wants to ask questions. There's a lot of very rich comments and thoughts that are going on today. Would anyone like to raise any particular questions? I mean, one thing I would say is that we don't have much time for questions, but I really think this is at the beginning of a conversation, not the end. So I'm sure that some of the discussions will continue. But can I say one thing that some of the things that I forget it was in the presentation that really resonate with me as a nomad, as a kind of expat, as a Brit in the States. I think one of the things I found both about Miami and about LA that I found actually in some ways welcoming was the fact that I didn't feel an outsider because, first of all, the dominant language in both cities is Spanish, and a lot of people are actually not even undocumented. There are a lot of undocumented migrants, which made it incredibly welcoming for an outsider myself. Anyway, let's Marina's just put a comment on the chat about the situation is metaphor. Under the paving stones is the beach. Absolutely. So let's. Do we have any questions? I mean. I'm sure there will be one question, but if you just wait long enough. I mean, I could ask some questions, but yeah. Now, I was also, just to say, from Camilo's point about how architecture in some ways, and I think we tend to sort of, think about architecture as having this kind of important role, but it's really the occupation of the architecture that I think is so important. I always use the example of the AA, a school in London that I taught at for a while, and somehow remains my kind of cultural home in a kind of strange way. The more I leave the UK, I never saw myself as being British, but the more I feel kind of strangely attached, and especially attached to the AA, which was a school not at all British. Actually, what was really strange about it was I taught there for a few years. And I didn't have a single British student, which made it extraordinary. Which also, I think, in some ways, Zaha's office is the same. There are 6 British people in an office of 400 or so architects. So there's a sense in which kind of like somehow the AA in Zaha's is deterritorialized in many sort of ways. But I guess the point about the AA is that it's situated in a building that's kind of part of Regency London. It's kind of a kind of a square that is very kind of dignified in some way, very different to the kind of extremely kind of progressive architecture being produced in this place. And it was designed as a building for, for a family. I mean, I assume that maybe the servants were in the basement or in the attic or something, but it was designed that way. But it's a school of architecture because of the performances that are going on there, the performativities, the rituals, the fact that architecture teaching is happening there. And that, to my mind, is exactly what I was, in my own work, was trying to think about how we see identity as being a kind of a form of performativity. We act out our lives in some sort of way, but equally architecture becomes a stage set in some senses, where those kind of those performances of performativities are acted out. And in some ways, buildings are kind of accrue their meaning through association with those activities, and maybe the architectural association as such is really, that's what it's all about. So I think what today we saw was actually, I mean, I think this reinforced my view that a city is nothing without its inhabitants, and a city doesn't get its identity from its buildings. You see all over the place architects saying, "Oh, this city needs an identity," by which they mean an enormous building that can appear on postcards and things. But no, I think that the identity of a city, I think, as Camilo really beautifully pointed out, that actually some of Miami looks very different, very similar to other cities all over the world, but it's what happens in the city, the kind of the lives that are lived out there, that really gives it a sense of what it is. And in some ways, I also, what I really appreciated in the presentations was, I think, the comment that Elisa was making, in the sense that, sure, I mean, there's been a kind of there's been an Americanization, maybe in Latin America, but there needs to be a Latin Americanization of a two-way process of North America, which I think is happening in an interesting kind of way. And we have to my mind, a kind of laboratory of a kind of petri dish of an experimental form of living, which is in which there are so many of these different tribes or groups that are so rich, and I think that's, in a way, to my mind, what makes Miami so interesting, so rich. It's the mix of different individuals and different peoples. And I also really appreciate Alfredo's comment about America is not European. And I think there's a rich history way beyond that is something that we need to be acknowledged. So there's a question from YouTube. Juan Calvache: how can Miami be pushed to produce its own identifiable architecture? Would it be born from exterior influence? Can it be born without exterior influence? Well, I think one thing is very clear, is actually Miami has its fair dose of external architectures. I mean, some of big name architects, of course. Does anyone want to comment on that question? We have 2 minutes, and we have to close down.
Well, I'd say Miami should look at itself, at its weather, at its environment, to produce something that would make it identifiable. And it's funny, we've seen that done with a few buildings by foreigners, like the PAM, for example, which is always being called out as this quintessential Miami building, and it was done by Swiss architects. So I think the reason is because that building really responds to its location, not only on the bay and the micro scale, but also the macro scale.
I think there is also the question of the vernacular and sort of the founding of this city, right? Like cities are founded for economic reasons, but there is kind of more like a clear moment when this happened, and Miami is more blurred, like it's more kind of accidental how it happened. So I don't know, identifying the vernacular, like the local, is very tricky. Like, what is like the Art Deco? Is that Miami architecture, right? Or is it the Steelsville on the water? Like, where are the elements, or the circle that Alfredo showed in the presentation? And if you go to Brickell, it's like, is this like a ruin? Like, is this the origin of this place? Like in the middle of all these people drinking on a yacht? Like, what's going on? So to me, the question is like, it's a great question, because it's a common question. Like, what is the sort of the local vernacular architecture of this place, and how could it be different than anything else? But I have to say, before, when I started teaching, Pan was not ready, and it was very difficult to point out tropical buildings to students, because there were not that many. So, you know, I'm thankful for Pan in that sense.
We need to wrap up. I want to finish with one comment. I mean, we've got I want to. We have a comment in the chat from Simon Vite from Argentina, who's been watching this on YouTube. And what we're doing, we're live streaming this, and I just want to ask Marina to read out the comment, not in English but in Spanish. It seems to me that kind of Spanish should be we should leave with a kind of Spanish comment. So Marina, could you possibly just in Spanish read out what the comment was?
Yes, sure. Just to say hello, I'm from Argentina, and I'm in Argentina right now. I'm taking classes, virtual classes, and just let me say that Simon Bilt is my student in the public university here in Argentina, and he is following the classes of the DDES from there on YouTube. So what he said is like in Spanish, es genial que todo este material esté en YouTube y abierto a quien quiera verlo. So what it means is like, it's great that you're sharing all this material on YouTube for them, and open to anyone who wants to see it. So to want to watch it, this classes. So thank you very much.
That's wonderful. Right. I think that one of the things is we're trying to be as inclusive as possible and to spread the message as far as possible. It's great that people are watching. I just wanted to finish by thanking the presentations. These were exquisitely beautiful presentations, really thoughtful, very sensitive, very colorful, and above all, very Latin American. So thank you so much for everything. This is going to be, it'll be recorded on, it'll be uploaded onto our YouTube channel. And just a final reminder to say that the time changes on Sunday at the clocks spring forward, but we will keep operating at exactly the same time. That'll mean a different starting time all over the world. I know that in China, the clocks stay the same. So it'll be starting at 9 o'clock in the evening rather than 10 o'clock. And likewise in Australia. But thank you so much for this extremely beautiful presentation. Really,
thank you for inviting us, Neil. It was a very provocative idea. I mean, made me think quite a bit. Actually, I learned some in the process. Definitely, I enjoy my colleagues very much. Thank you.
You know, one thing I'd say is about America is that it often takes a foreigner to come in and talk about America. Raina Banham came in and opened up the question about American architecture from the UK. Likewise, Umberto Eco, Jean Baudrillard, and so on. It often takes to be the catalyst of this. But I was just the catalyst. You were the people who were kind of presenting, and it was really a beautiful, beautiful session. So thank you so much. Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
See you. Bye-bye.